What's up, Tumnadlectures? In this video, we are going to look on what we call the fetal circulation. If you find this video helpful at the end of it all, please make sure you like the video, comment down in the comment section, and please subscribe. Let's go ahead and get started. In this video, we are taking a look on what we call the fetal circulation. We are going to be looking at the fetal circulation before birth, and even also some look on what we call fetal circulation just after birth. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So now, first thing first, we need to first understand what is fetal circulation. Now, fetal circulation just simply means the flow of blood direct from the maternal side through the placenta, and then it goes what we call the growing fetus. Okay, what we call the flow of blood direct from the maternal side through what we call the placenta, and then it goes into what we call the growing fetus. Now, before we go into the detail of what we call fetal circulation, I want us first to go through what we call the orientation of this diagram and see how we call all these different parts of what we call the fetal circulation. Now, when you come over here on this beautiful structure here, this beautiful structure here is what we call the placenta. Okay, what we call the placenta. Okay, what we call the placenta. So now this placenta is so much important. Actually, it is everything during what we call fetal life. It serves a lot of the roles. It is going to be feeding the growing fetus with oxygen, with a lot of the nutrients, and it is even the one that's going to be draining away all what we call the waste coming from what we call the fetus. I can say that what we call the placenta is everything during fetal life. Okay. Now, when you come off on what you call the placenta, we have this beautiful black-like structure here, which is going to be enclosing different kind of the blood vessels. This beautiful kind of black structure, which is going to be enclosing the different kind of blood vessels, this one here is what we call the umbilical cord. Okay, so on here is what we call the umbilical, what we call the umbilical cord. Very, 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 very important. It's going to be housing three beautiful kind of the blood vessels and even some other structures we shall talk about later. Okay. Then when you come over inside, we're going to be seeing we're going to be having a lot of different kind of the blood vessels. You see the one which is a bit like bluish. They're going to be two in number, and even also have this one which is a bit red. And this beautiful red one is going to be what we call the umbilical vein. You see this beautiful kind, very, very, very important, going to be carrying a lot of the blood, which is rich in oxygen, rich in nutrients, direct from what you call from the mother's side through the placenta, and it's got feed what we call the growing fetus. So now this one, he said, is what we call the umbilical. Is what we call the umbilical vein. Okay, very, very, very important. So now, as this umbilical vein is taking this blood, eventually it's going to be meeting this structure here, which we are calling the liver. And when this umbilical vein reaches the liver, something beautiful is going to be happening. Now, blood is going to be bypassing the liver, and then it enters direct into what we call the inferior vena cava. Now, the question is, how do we call that kind of the shunt? That's going to be shunting this blood direct from what we call the umbilical vein, and then it drops it direct into what we call the inferior vena cava. Now, this kind of the shunt is what we call the ductus venosus. Okay, so now this kind of the shunt is what we call the ductus. Ductus venosus. Okay, what we call the ductus venosus. It is that beautiful shunt that's going to be shunting this blood direct from what we call the umbilical vein direct into what we call the inferior vena cava. And of course, the inferior vena cava, blood which is going to be coming from the lower extremities will eventually join up with what we call oxygenated blood coming from what we call the ductus venosus, and then it enters inside this kind of the beautiful inferior vena cava. Okay. So now, this kind of a beautiful kind of the vein is what we call the inferior vena cava, and that one is going to be for the case of short. Okay. Now, all this blood is going to be dropping into what we call the right atrium, and of course, the right atrium is going to be receiving all the blood coming from what we call inferior vena cava, and even also blood coming from what we call the superior vena cava. Okay. So now, this one here is going to be what we call our right atrium. And of course, this one here is going to be our left atrium. When we come over down here, this one is going to be what we call the right ventricle, and then this one here is going to be what we call the left. Such a beautiful thing, okay? But when this blood reaches what you call the right atrium, something beautiful is going to be happening. Now, before we go into the detail of what's going to be happening into what we call the right atrium, something which is so much beautiful is that 80% of the blood which is coming from what you call inferior vena cava, as it lands into what you call the right atrium, yeah, it's going to be directed through this beautiful kind of the tube. Okay, this kind of the opening, this kind of the hole. You know how this hole is called, which is going to be on what we call the interatrial septum. It is connecting the right atrium to what we call the left atrium, and that kind of the beautiful kind of the hole is what we call the foramen ovale. Okay, what we call the foramen ovale. So now 80% of the blood from the right atrium is going to be directed through the what we call the foramen ovale, direct into what we call the left atrium. Now the question is, what's that kind of the beautiful structure that plays that beautiful role in directing the majority of the blood to pass through what we call the foramen ovale into what we call the left atrium? There is another beautiful kind of the valve here. See this beautiful valve which is like a bit black. It's like a bit black just on the entrance of what we call the inferior vena cava. That beautiful kind of valve is what we call the eustachian valve. That eustachian valve plays a beautiful role in shunting blood direct from the right atrium and then pass through what we call the foramen ovale. So now that kind of a beautiful eustachian valve is playing a very beautiful, but of course after birth it shrinks down and it becomes a harmless kind of the rumina. Okay. Then when you come over here, you see this green structure here. There's going to be an opening of what we call the coronary sinus. But of course, also have a small kind of the valve, which we call the Sebastian valve, which closes when the atria contracts to avoid the blood from returning back to what we call the coronary sinus, back into what we call the myocardium. Okay, so now also have this beautiful valve, which we call the Sebastian valve. Okay. So now our blood has now entered into what we call the left atria. But before we go into very far, I want to take you through on what we call pressure differences during fetal life in what we call the heart. What's going to be the pressure differences between the right side of the heart and then the left side of the heart? Now, I want to first drive you through what we call the lungs. So now these ones here are going to be our lungs. And of course, what's going to be happening in our lungs is something which is so much beautiful. I want us to pay much attention to what's going to be happening in the lung. So now I want to assume that this one is going to be our air sac. Okay, this one is going to be our air sac. But in this air sac, we do not have something called oxygen. Okay, there is no oxygen in what we call in the air sac. Meaning that these blood vessels which are going to be passing on what we call this kind of the air sac, as they won't take away the oxygen. You know what's going to be happening? These kind of the blood vessels which are calling the pulmonary arterioles, they are going to undergo what we call vasoconstriction. Okay, they are going to undergo what we call vasoconstriction. Okay, what we call vasoconstriction. Now, if they undergo what we call vasoconstriction, it means that the entire pulmonary arterioles of the whole kind of the lung is going to undergo what we call vasoconstriction of this left lung and even also what we call the right lung. They're all going to undergo what we call vasoconstriction. And the reason for that is what we call the hypoxia. There's no oxygen. So now that kind of the mechanism is what we call hypoxic, vaso vasoconstriction. Okay, hypoxic vasoconstriction. Okay, that's what's going to be happening on entire kind of the lungs. So now what happens that because of that kind of the vasoconstriction, we are going to be having a lot of the resistance in what we call the lungs. And that kind of resistance is also going to be increasing a lot of the pressure during what we call the pulmonary arteries. And that kind of the pressure is going to be now backing up down up to what we call to the ventricles, meaning that even also you're going to be having an extensive amount of the pressures in what we call the right ventricle. And for that reason, During fetal life, we are going to be having a lot of the pressures within what we call the right ventricle than what we call the left ventricle. And generally, we're going to be having high pressure within the right side of the heart compared to what we call the left side of the heart. And that one also explains why most of the blood is going to be passing through what we call the foramen of valve to go through what we call the low system part, which is going to be the left side of the heart. And now the remaining little of the blood from the superior vena cava will move down through what we call the right atrium and then moves down to what we call the right ventricle. And of course, from the right ventricle, however much is the high system ventricle, is going to be now forcing this blood to move up. Okay, but now as this blood moves up, there is this beautiful kind of the hole because this blood doesn't want to go this side because the lungs are not functional during this time. Okay, there's no need of this blood going to what we call to the lung. Now, what happens that because there's so much resistance in the lungs, and the left side of the heart is going to be a low system during fetal life, meaning that even this blood from the left ventricle, which is ejected in what we call the aorta, we are going to be having low pressures within the aorta. Meaning that as this blood comes over here, we have this beautiful kind of the shunt. You know how this shunt is called? This shunt here is what we call the ductus, the ductus arteriosus. Okay, the ductus arteriosus. Now, this shunt is so much beautiful. It is preventing the blood which wants to go to the lungs, and then it takes this route and then it joins what you call the aorta. And of course, from the aorta, it's now moved down throughout the entire body parts. Okay, so now during fetal life, we're going to be having an extensive amount of the pressures within the right side of the heart compared to what we call the left side of the heart. And we said that the cause of that one was because of what we call hypoxic vasoconstriction happening in the lungs, increasing what we call pulmonary resistance to the blood flow that side. And besides that, there's no need of blood going to the lungs because the lungs are not functional during that time. Okay. So now we said that now blood is now in the left atrium will move down through what we call the bicuspid valve to the left ventricle, and then from the left ventricle it will squeeze this blood as if it has never squeezed before, and this blood will pass through what we call the aorta. So now the whole of this structure here is going to be what we call the aorta. Okay, and then for the aorta to move down, what we call the thoracic aorta, the abdominal aorta, and it moves down, down, and down. Now, when it reaches here, we're going to be having something very much beautiful. Now, we're going to be having a bifurcation of what we call the aorta into two kind of the common arteries. This one here is going to be what we call the right. This one here is going to be what we call the right common iliac artery. And then, of course, this one here is going to be what we call the left common iliac artery. Okay, so now these ones here, these first branches are going to be the common iliac arteries, but eventually they are also going to be breaking into two. Okay, it is breaking into what we call the external and then what we call the internal. Okay, so now this one here is going to be what we call the external iliac artery, and this is going to be what we call the internal iliac artery. And then also on the left side, this one is going to be the external iliac artery, and then this one here is going to be what we call the internal iliac artery. Now, these internal iliac arteries, they are giving off to beautiful kind of the arteries that is taking blood which is full of what we call waste products and having less of oxygen. I don't want to say that this blood which is going to be in these blood vessels that they are is deoxygenated. I can't say that because it's going to be containing some amount of oxygen, approximately around 50%. Okay, but it's going to be full of waste products coming from what we call from the growing fetus, and then they will move it down to one to the umbilical cord, and then it goes back at what we call the placenta, and then for the placenta it will get exchanged with now the nutritious blood, and even also what we call oxygen rich blood. So now the question is, how do we call this bluish kind of the arteries? They are going to be two in number. These kind of the arteries are what we call the umbilical arteries. Okay, they are what we call the umbilical. They are what we call the umbilical arteries. Okay, so now these ones here are what we call the umbilical arteries. They are so much important, carrying blood which is going to be having a lot of the waste, but having low percentage of what we call the oxygen levels, approximately around 50%. Okay. So now that briefly covers what we call fetal circulation. So let's just have a very quick recap of what we have just said. We said that this is going to be our placenta, which is going to be picking blood from the maternal side, and then also is going to be helping us deliver what we call oxygen and deliver what we call the nutrients, and even also to drain away what we call the waste products back to what we call to the maternal blood. Okay, and then we say that this black structure here is going to be what we call the umbilical cord, which is going to be housing three kind of the blood vessels, the one which we are calling the umbilical vein and what we call the umbilical arteries. Okay, we said that this kind of the red, this kind of the blood vessel, which is going to be one, is going to be what you call the umbilical vein. This umbilical vein comes over when it reaches on the liver. It gives off a beautiful kind of the shunt that helps the blood to bypass what we call the liver, which we call the ductus venosus. But something which is so much beautiful that we have a very small kind of the branch which goes what we call to the sinusoid, and of course this is going to be supplying some little part of the blood for the case of the maturity or the growing of what we call of the liver. But much of the blood is going to be shunted to what we call the ductus venosus, and then it will join the blood coming from the lower extremity of the fetus, and then this is what we call the inferior vena cava. And eventually this blood for the inferior vena cava, which is going to be containing a lot of the oxygen, approximately 80%, will drop into what we call the right atrium. And of course, we said that 80% of the blood is going to be shunted into what we call the foramen ovale, and that process is going to be aided by this kind of the beautiful structure here, which we call the eustachian valve, which is going to be on the entrance of what we call the inferior vena cava. And then this blood is going to be moving to what we call the left atrium. But we also have this blood coming from what we call the superior vena cava, which moves down the right atrium and then down what we call the right ventricle. And the blood is going to be passing through what we call the right ventricle. It's going to be approximately around 20%, and this blood is going to be containing a lot of the CO2. Okay, this blood is going to be more deoxygenated. And of course, we have said that because in the lungs, you're going to be having a lot of the resistance, as this blood is ejected through what we call the pulmonary trunk, the pulmonary arteries, because we don't want this blood to go to what we call to the lung. This blood takes this kind of the shortcut, which you're calling the ductus arteriosus. Why? Because during fetal life, you're going to be having an extensive amount of the pressures in the right side of the heart compared to what we call the left side of the heart. And for that reason, we're going to be having low pressures within what we call the aorta. So now, and that one also explains why this blood in the pulmonary arteries will take this kind of a shortcut to move into the areas which is going to be having low pressure. And of course, you know, blood likes moving from the areas of high pressures to the areas of the low pressures. Now, during fetal life, you're going to be having high pulmonary pressures. And for that reason, that little blood which comes off from the right ventricle into the pulmonary circulation will take this route and then enters what we call the aorta through what we call the ductus arteriosus. Okay. So now this blood from the left atrium, which is coming from what we call the foramen ovale, will move to what we call the left ventricle, and then left ventricle will squeeze this blood to what we call the aorta, and then it moves it down through what we call the aorta, then down. At reaches down, you're going to be having this kind of bifurcation. You're going to be having what we call the left common iliac artery and what we call the right common iliac artery, which are going to be giving off two kind of the branches, the external iliac arteries and then the internal iliac arteries. And it is within the internal iliac arteries that you're going to be having this beautiful kind of the arteries, which we call the umbilical arteries. Going to be carrying blood, is going to be containing a lot of the waste and also going to be containing some little percentage of what we call oxygen, approximately around 50%. And then, of course, it will drive off this blood and then it takes it back to what we call to the placenta. And then all the waste will be drained into what we call into the placenta. And then in exchange of what we call oxygen-rich blood and even also nutritious-rich blood. Now that we have seen what's going to be happening, what we call fetal circulation, let's just have what we call the order of blood flow before birth. Okay. So now looking on the blood flow before birth, we say that blood is going to be starting from what we call the placenta, and then from the placenta it will move to what we call the umbilical vein. From the umbilical vein to move what we call the ductus venosus. From the ductus venosus to join what we call the inferior vena cava. From the inferior vena cava to drop into what we call the right atrium. And of course, don't forget there's some blood coming from what we call the superior vena cava. But of course, we are taking the majority because this blood is going to be rich in oxygen and rich in what we call the nutrients. Okay. And then from what we call the right atrium, majority of the blood, 80%, will pass to what we call the foramen ovale. And then from the foramen ovale to go to what we call the left atrium. And then from the left atrium to squeeze down to what we call the left ventricle, to squeeze this blood into what we call the aorta. And then from what we call from the aorta, this blood is going to be supplied to the entire body tissues. And then eventually, we're going to be having a lot of the blood collected into what we call the umbilical arteries. And of course, the umbilical arteries will drive this blood back, what we call, to the placenta. Okay, thank you very much for watching. And if you think whatever I've talked is making sense, is really adding to you, you're benefiting, please, you can hit like button, comment down in the comment section, and please subscribe. So now in the next video, moving into part 2, which is going to be explaining on the events which happens immediately after the birth. As always, Tumnad, until we meet next time.